Agnostics Skeptics and Ratio Christi. My name is Austin and I will be the moderator tonight. The title of this discussion is, Can There Be Good Without God? The panel will explore the grounding of morality in both the theistic and secular worldviews. Our moral values and principles are at the heart of a well-functioning society, and thus this is probably one of the most important conversations we could have. We have no illusions that we will be able to solve these issues that have befuddled humankind for centuries in the next 2 hours. However, in the spirit of mutual cooperation, respect, and goodwill between people, no matter their background, it is our hope that this discussion will do a little bit to at least allow everyone to better understand these issues. Ratio Christi, Latin for the Reason of Christ, is a student ministry organization that focuses on discussing the hard questions of Christianity. They seek to engage the minds of both believers and non-believers by providing evidence for the truthfulness of Christianity and by engaging beliefs and ideologies contrary to Christianity. Ratio Christi meets on Monday evenings from 7 to 8:30 in the Elliott University Center Dogwood Room. Their website is uncg.ratiochristi.org. If you have your programs, you will see the bios for our panelists representing Ratio Christi, Bill Pratt and Adam Tucker, and that's on the inside front cover. The UNCG Atheists and Agnostics and Skeptics have been on campus since the fall semester of 2009. Their goal is to educate the campus about a secular worldview, to provide networking and support for other non-believers on campus, and to promote the separation of church and state. They have meetings every Friday night from 7 to 9 in the EUC Phillips Room. Debating for them tonight is Robert Eldredge and Josh Deaton. If you turn to the back page of your programs, you will see more information about each group, including future events. One event of special note is the second joint event by these two groups, which will be held on Thursday, April 14th. It will be a debate between Dr. John Shook from the Center for Inquiry and Dr. Richard Howe, professor at Southern Evangelical Seminary, titled, Does God Exist? The location and exact time will be announced in the future, so keep an eye out for that. Now on to the discussion, but first, among the flyers and pamphlets that you were handed, you received a small questionnaire card. If you have not done so already, please fill out the before section of this card. After the discussion is over, please fill out the after section. The purpose is a fun test to see how audience opinion may have changed throughout the discussion, and the results will be available online within a week on the Facebook event page and at the respective group websites. If you turn to the middle of your program, you will see the format of tonight's discussion. Each panelist will give an opening statement no longer than 8 minutes. I will give a 1-minute warning. After opening statements, we will go right into discussion, with each side getting 17 minutes to lead a conversation with the other side. I will give a 5-minute and a 1-minute warning. The rules of these are that both sides will engage in a direct conversation with one another, but the side that is leading discussion gets to decide when conversation on a topic will begin and end. There will also be a brief pause between the two 17-minute discussions to allow our camera operators to change tapes if need be. Each side will then have 5 minutes to deliver a closing statement, which can be given in any way either side sees fit. The Q&A part of the debate will be handled by note cards. Please write your question on the note cards, indicating which side you wish to address your question, and during the break, volunteers will go through the audience collecting note cards. There will then be a minimum 30-minute period where the audience questions will be posed to either side. My role as moderator will mostly be as a timekeeper and to keep discussion moving during the discussion period and audience Q&A. If one panelist delivers a long and perhaps repetitive answer, I may step in and ask them to quickly and briefly sum up what they're trying to say so the other side may have a chance to respond. Finally, we ask the audience to avoid any outbursts or comments. Obviously, the occasional involuntary laughter or gasp is appropriate, but please do not shout out during the discussion, and please hold applause until the very end. Because the UNCG Atheists will be answering tonight's question in the affirmative, they will deliver their opening statements first, lead discussion, and deliver their closing statement last. Without further ado, the clock will begin as soon as either Robert or Josh begins their statement.
First, I would of course like to thank all of you for being here tonight. The question of this panel is, can there be good without God? There are many things that we would all agree as being morally praiseworthy actions, such as volunteering at a soup kitchen, donating toys to children, helping a stranger change a tire on the side of the road. I would like to say that the four of us up here actually agree on 85% of our moral ideas. Our disagreement on where those morals come from, which actually leads to disagreement on the remaining 15%, which I'll get into later. Our Christian friends up here will say that good can only come from God, that a morality that makes any sense and is objective must be external to us. It must come from God. And the moral foundations that do not rest on that fact are just arbitrary opinions. I want to levy an objection here and ask the question, how can we know that God is good and that God is the being that gets to tell us what is right from wrong? If God is the standard of our morality, because God is perfect and embedded in perfection is perfect goodness, then what you have is an unevidenced, arbitrary definitional claim that does not warrant much discussion or use of our own rationality and ideas. God is good because God is good. It is nice and circular and does not require much thought. However, if we know God is good because of the good that God does in the world, if we have evidence of that good, then that requires us to use our own moral intuitions and judgments to figure out what is good. God, in this case, is again not required to determine morality because we have to judge the actions of the God to figure out what is moral. So, either we are faced with a situation where we can take an active and constructive role in our morality, which does not require God, or we are forced to subjugate our own moral reasoning and intuition to a God that we can see has questionable moral judgments at best and might not even exist.
The source of our morality is complex. It is not external to us, but it is also not exclusively a social construction. Our morality is defined by a combination of personal social influences, evolution, personal experience, cultural upbringing, and individual reason. Our moral ideas are not entirely rational, though, because we cannot, as social creatures, fully divorce ourselves from our upbringing and our surroundings. Many will say that this idea leads to a sort of cultural relativism, that without an independent standard outside of ourselves, our morality is nothing more than a personal opinion which we cannot force upon others. This is not true. Our values and convictions matter because we place value in them, and we are perfectly within our right to advance our own values as better than someone else's because they are our own. And having this type of system is actually a good. Recognizing the simple truth that morality is not independent of us, but is developed from within us, does not inevitably lead to a situation of moral paralysis, but it leads us to be more humble, more open, and willing to change and discuss ideas and values with others. This is an uplifting and empowering idea that puts the human at the center of our moral judgments. The question then becomes, by what standard do we judge these competing moral ideas? Well, we can judge them by looking at our foundational principles and what effect our actions have on others, our neighbors, and society. We define what is moral based upon what would allow us to live our best life possible and what will promote the general social welfare. In fact, I think all of us up here share similar values. We want people to live long, healthy, productive lives. We want to treat each other with respect and fairness. We think that all humans have a basic self-worth and basic dignity that should not be violated. We should treat each other both in the way they would want to be treated and the way we would want to be treated in return. And once we agree on these principles, as I think we do, we can use our rationality and empiricism to see if we are actually achieving those goals. And this is why religious belief can actually become a handicap to figuring out the good. Let's take one quick example that illustrates this point. Many Christian attitudes towards same-sex relationships and marriage. A lot of Christians view same-sex relationships as immoral, and they have this opinion because of an appeal to unevidenced tradition. What are Christians doing when they oppose same-sex marriage and view same-sex relationships as immoral? They are taking actions that violate the basic principles of our shared ethic, that we should treat each other with mutual respect, fairness, and equality and recognize each other's basic human dignity. They're taking actions that prevent gay and lesbian couples from leading their best life possible. What compounds this problem is that this false moral judgment actually leads to real harm in society. It creates a situation where anti-gay bigots are given comfort and aid, and children are denied access to loving homes. Make no mistake, this moral judgment is evil as it poisons both the principles of fairness and human dignity that our social morality is based on, and it erodes our pursuit of a cohesive society. So, can there be good without God? Not only can there be good without God, but it is easier to find good without God because our own moral intuition, rational faculties that are constructed by our society, biology, and rationality are not tied down by appeals to a tradition that is based upon a fiction. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming out. My name is Josh. Nearly 400 years before the purported birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote his classic dialogue featuring Socrates and Euthyphro. This particular dialogue is considered classic because it poses a dilemma for theists regarding the nature of goodness. Socrates threw into question how his fellow God-fearing countrymen determine what makes something good. Euthyphro thought it was piety. Today, many religious people would perhaps say that love or compassion is the ultimate guide for all of our behavior. But here's the Socratic dilemma. Is that which the gods love good because they love it? Or do they love it because it is good? So, for example, is compassion good because it pleases your God? Or does compassion please your God because it's good? In other words, goodness is either divinely arbitrary, morality simply is what God commands, or reasonable. Now, if the quality of goodness is determined by a reasonable criteria independent of the will of the gods, then all of us, theists, deists, pantheists, atheists, whatever you may be, all of us are in the same boat, all struggling to figure out what the good life really is all about. Now, it's simply a matter of fact that there is no universal consensus on what constitutes good behavior. I think we can all agree with that. It's a fact that for most of our history, we've been at war with one another, violating each other's sense of what ought to be valued or respected. And it is precisely in the aftermath of the horrors of such violence that humans have constructed systems of governance intended to maintain a reasonable level of stability necessary for human flourishing. Based on our collective experiences of abject misery, we attempt to erect protective barriers, and we call them rights, against which future aggressive behaviors are not permitted to transgress. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights didn't fall from heaven, nor was it revealed to a lone prophet on a smoke-filled mountain. And yet, it is by far a more decent, compassionate, rational, and coherent expression of the value of human existence than anything found in any Holy Scripture. We need not be divided over this issue, though. In fact, I believe it is urgently necessary, if we're concerned about stability and peace, that we find a way to reason with one another across our different values of what we consider to be good. But back to Euthyphro's dilemma. The first option, that the sole criterion for goodness is what pleases the gods, is clearly problematic. It inherently deconstructs the virtue of compassion. Helping the less fortunate is simply obeying a command, rather than an empathetic gesture based on individual reflection. Whereas the secularists, such as Robert and myself, are often accused of cultural relativism, this sort of theism is guilty of a sort of divine relativism. The most grotesque acts in history can be justified in the name of a god, a practice which we're all familiar with. Now, okay, if you believe in God, you might say, of course, my God would never command anything evil, he will only command what is good. Well, is that because your deity's behavior is judged by a standard of goodness independent of the deity's will? If so, then you ascribe to the second option of Euthyphro's dilemma, and we're all once again in the same boat, trying to reason with one another, trying to figure out what the good life is that would please your God or please each other. But to say that your God only wills the good, because what is good is what he wills, is clearly circular and not a response to the dilemma. If whatever God wants, unconstrained by any external standard, is that which is good, then one cannot rightly protest the divine will, regardless of any unreasonable or rational suffering produced. After all, God's ways are not our ways, or so we're told. And it is this sort of capricious and arbitrary approach to divinely sanctioned goodness is actually what one finds in the Christian scripture, if you're the type of believer who thinks the Bible is inspired by God and thus infallible. Killing one's own child can be a good thing, if it pleases the gods, such as when Yahweh told Abraham to offer his son as a burnt sacrifice in Genesis 22. Abraham was praised, being the father of our faith, because of his willingness to kill his own son, not for questioning the goodness of such monstrous behavior. Then there is, of course, the matter of divinely mandated ethnic cleansing in the Bible. Hopefully we all can agree that's an evil today. For just one of many examples, turn your Bibles to Numbers 31, if you have a Bible, and read the divinely ordered ethnic cleansing of the Midianites. Apparently because some Midianite women had turned some Israelite men to the worship of foreign gods, the Israelites were ordered to kill every male, adult and child, kill every woman who has known a man intimately, but verse 18, quote, all the girls who have not known a man intimately, spare for yourselves. And verse 21 confirms that this is a word straight from God to Moses, thus it must be unquestionably good. But was it ever really good to wipe out an entire people group? Was the rape that is implied in verse 18 ever good? Are you serious? Was slavery, child sacrifice, executing people for simply believing in different things? Was such barbarity acceptable because it happened in a different time and place? Well, if you believe in the Bible as inspired by God and literally true, it didn't just happen. It was divinely mandated. And it wasn't just an acceptable monstrosity. The terror and suffering were good because apparently they reflected the will of your God. Now, on his blog, Bill Pratt proposes a third option to the dilemma. Namely that, quoting Bill here, goodness is part of God's nature. God is the good. His nature does not change, so he cannot declare murder to be right tomorrow. That's a quote from Bill. But this does not answer the dilemma at all. It simply pushes the question back from what pleases God to what God's nature is like, which is what determines what pleases God after all, I would think. I don't know how we could probe the mystery of God in that way, but whatever. But again, the question remains, is something good because it aligns with God's nature, as reflected in God's commands, or is God's nature good as measured by some independent standard? So Bill says that God will only command what is good because his nature is good, and we know that his nature is good because he only commands that which is good. That's kind of a big circle. And if you believe that God, your God, bound by his nature, can never command murder, then I believe that you ought to reevaluate your belief in the Bible as the inerrant Word of God.
1 minute, Josh.
If there are reasons that certain behavior qualifies as good, other than it pleasing the deity, then we access that judgment through rational discourse. We have to reason with one another, persuade one another, fight one another, and quite frequently cooperate with one another. Belief or lack thereof in God is somewhat secondary. One's worldview certainly shapes the rationale we all bring to the table. And the complex problems of our world are not given magic answers from a heavenly solution generator, but they're not given absolute certainty from the accumulated brilliance of modern science either. People of the same faith, the same denomination, same theology come to different conclusions about the goodness of this or that action. Atheists disagree with each other. I disagree with Robert about a lot of things. Our differences are a matter of fact, but our future is as yet unwritten. If we are concerned with reducing the overwhelming, gratuitous suffering in our world, we must find a way to reason with one another, cooperate, and respect one another. I can offer you my reasons for my values, reevaluate my values based on evidence, critical scrutiny, and find ways to cooperate. Compromise is inevitable, but this is progress, and surely a reasonable and compassionate deity would not object. Thank you. You got it?
Thank you for coming out tonight, and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in this discussion. Robert, thank you especially for your excellent work of organizing this event and bringing it all together. I have a confession to make. I have a new addiction. Have any of you been to one of these new frozen yogurt bars? They have about 10 different flavors of frozen yogurt and all the mix-ins and toppings you could think of. I'm addicted to Tahitian vanilla with chocolate chips and waffle cone pieces. But of course, if you happen not to like Tahitian vanilla, there are about 9 other flavors you could choose from. I realize, though, that some people don't like frozen yogurt at all, and some people have different tastes than myself. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer preferred to sexually assault his neighbors and eat them. I certainly don't like his taste in fine dining, and I doubt his neighbors did either. But if God doesn't exist, we cannot meaningfully say that Jeffrey Dahmer did anything wrong. We may not like what he did, but without God, it wasn't actually wrong. The argument is quite simple. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. I want to make a few things clear at the outset. Bill and I are Christians. However, we are not arguing for full-blown Christian theism tonight. We are simply arguing that a theistic worldview better accounts for our moral reality. For those unaware, theism is the belief in a being who is the uncaused, personal, timeless, and immaterial cause of the existence of the universe and the ground of moral reality. This being we will refer to as God. Furthermore, by objective moral values, I mean moral values which reflect the good, and that are for all people at all times, in all places, whether anyone believes in them or not. I should clarify that I am not saying that a person cannot be good without believing in God. Certainly they can, as our atheist friends demonstrate to us. Someone can read and enjoy a good novel without necessarily believing in authors. Nor am I saying that a person cannot know what is good without believing in God. On the contrary, I will argue that they certainly can and do know what is good. Finally, I am not insinuating that someone will eat their neighbors if they don't believe in God. I don't think they will. What I am saying is similar to what atheistic philosopher J.L. Mackie concluded when he said, quote, moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of properties and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them, unquote. Let us now examine the argument I have made. We will examine premise 2 first. Is it the case that objective moral values do exist? The short answer seems to be yes, and any properly functioning human being knows this instinctively. As J. Budichevsky says, quote, everyone knows certain principles. There is no land where murder is virtue and gratitude vice, unquote. Philosophers call such knowledge properly basic. For example, we clearly know that torturing babies for fun is wrong for anyone at any time in any place because we innately know that human beings have value and inalienable rights, as even our Declaration of Independence and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights acknowledge. Our atheist friends have demonstrated their knowledge of the basics of morality even tonight by wanting to have a discussion, quote, in the spirit of mutual cooperation, respect, and goodwill between people no matter their background, unquote. As Christian philosopher William Lane Craig says, quote, if someone fails to see the objective moral truth about such matters, then he is simply morally handicapped, like the colorblind person who cannot tell the difference between red and green. And there's no reason to think that his impairment should make us call into question what we see clearly, unquote. In other words, if someone denies that torturing babies for fun is wrong, they don't need an argument, they need help. This is further illustrated by our reactions, if not by our actions. Even the thief thinks stealing is wrong when his car is stolen. Furthermore, there could be no moral progress apart from objective morality. To say freedom is better than slavery, and we're making progress in civil rights, is to suggest there is a perfect standard to comparing such progress to, and freedom more closely reflects that standard than slavery does. Such comparisons cannot happen without objective moral values. As C.S. Lewis said, quote, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line, unquote. This means that moral values are discovered by us, not invented by us. So it seems as though premise 2 is true. Objective moral values do exist. Bill will mention several characteristics of these moral values, but for now let us focus on the fact that they are a form of communication from one mind to another. Moral values come in the form of imperatives. For example, you should not murder another human. These imperatives have an oughtness to them. In other words, they are prescriptive. They tell us what we ought to do. We tend to feel a sense of guilt when we don't do something we know we ought to do, or when we do something we know we ought not do. We generally call this our conscience. We can certainly choose to ignore our conscience, and some people choose to ignore it to the point of having no guilt whatsoever. We typically call such people sociopaths. Let us now turn to premise 1. Can such objective moral values exist apart from God? I think there are only 3 possibilities for explaining the existence of these moral values. 1, they're an illusion. 2, they are brute facts, or the product of chance in a mindless universe. Or 3, they are the product of intelligence, or mind. We've already seen that objective moral values do exist, and to think they are illusory leads to nonsensical conclusions. Bill will discuss why these moral imperatives cannot be accounted for as the product of chance or simple brute facts. Suffice it to say that we have no moral obligation to impersonal forces. Astronauts do nothing morally wrong when they defy the law of gravity. Our only other option is intelligence, or mind. A moral law implies a moral lawgiver. As Christian philosopher Francis Bacon says, quote, "The source of morality must be a self-existent, perfectly good being whose realm of authority is the entire universe. It seems fitting to call such a being God," unquote. My atheist friends have brought up what is known as Euthyphro's dilemma. It asks, quote, "Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good?" Unquote. Either way, it seems the theist is stuck. If something is good because God commands it, then the good is arbitrary. If, however, God commands something because it's good, then there is a standard that is beyond God that even he must conform to. The answer to the question is that this is a false dilemma. There is another option. The good is God, and God is the good. In other words, the standard for objective moral values is the very nature of God. William Lane Craig says, quote, "God's moral character expresses itself toward us in the form of certain commandments, which become for us our moral duties. Hence, God's commandments are not arbitrary, but necessarily flow from his own nature. They are necessary expressions of the way God is," unquote. The theistic God, by definition, is uncaused and unlimited or pure existence. He is all that he is in a necessary and unlimited way. As a necessary being, he cannot change. Thus, his nature cannot change. Hence, morality is not arbitrary, since God cannot violate his own nature. Also, God does not conform to the good as some abstract standard to himself. As Christian thinker Paul Copan put it, quote, "God, who is essentially perfect, does not have obligations to some external moral standard. God simply acts, and it is good. God does not fulfill moral obligations, but simply expresses the goodness of the divine nature," unquote. Without such a stopping point as the nature of God, we're left with an infinite series of contingent moral standards that somehow derive their incumbency from another standard, so on and so forth ad infinitum. Such a source of objective moral values is simply untenable. While I would encourage you to try some Tahitian vanilla with chocolate chips rather than eating your neighbor, at least Jeffrey Dahmer was consistent. He said, quote, "If it all happens naturalistically, what's the need for a God? Can I set my own rules? Who owns me? I own myself," unquote. Can there be good without God? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. But objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists, and moral values find their existence in him.
All right, thank you. Bear with me, losing my voice, so I'll try to speak as loudly as I can. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and I especially want to thank Josh and Robert for agreeing to discuss these issues with Adam and I. And I was actually very impressed by their opening statements. They're very, very bright guys. We're going to have a lot of fun tonight. That's an understatement. In Adam's opening statement, he mentioned two very important characteristics of morality. First, he demonstrated that there are at least some objective moral values that exist, values that are shared by all people at all times and all places. Second, Adam noted that morality consists of duties. Morality has a strong prescriptive element to it. It tells us how we ought to behave. What I would like to explore is whether the worldview of atheistic naturalism provides rational grounds for the existence of objective moral values and the existence of objective moral duties. What I mean by atheistic naturalism is the worldview which says that everything that exists comes from matter and energy. Nothing exists that cannot ultimately be reduced to the laws of physics. With regard to how human beings originated, naturalists believe that the blind and purposeless process of Darwinian evolution did all the work. This is the worldview that today stands as the major contender to Christian theism in Western civilization. William Provine, atheist professor of biological sciences at Cornell University, summarizes this worldview this way, quote, "There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There is no life after death. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either," end quote. Can this worldview explain the existence of objective moral values? It doesn't seem to. Why? Because the idea of objective moral values is a non-starter for most naturalists. What we think of as objective moral values reduces to mere emotions or instincts that the process of evolution has placed in us. Atheist journalist Robert Wright explains, quote, If within a species there is variation among individuals in their hereditary traits, and some traits are more conducive to survival and reproduction than others, then those traits will become more widespread within the population. The result is that the species' aggregate pool of hereditary traits changes, end quote. Philosopher Paul Churchland further explains, quote, the important point about the standard evolutionary story is that the human species and all of its features are the wholly physical outcome of a purely physical process. If this is the correct account of our origin, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties into our theoretical accounts of ourselves. We are creatures of matter, end quote. But if there are no non-physical substances, then there can be no objective moral values. Morality collapses into complete subjectivity. You have your moral feelings and I have mine. Objective moral values are just an illusion. Agnostic philosopher Michael Ruse agrees. He says, quote, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate it that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory, end quote. Under atheistic naturalism, there seems to be no room at all for the existence of objective moral values. What about moral duties? Does naturalism give us a rational explanation for where moral duties come from? Again, I would have to say no. Naturalists believe that morality is just a byproduct of undirected biological processes. But in that case, all the naturalist has done is tell us what moral feelings we have, not why we have any duty to follow those feelings. How can a purely physical and purposeless process give us commands that we ought to obey? Commands come from people, not elements in the periodic chart. Philosopher Francis Beckwith explains that evolutionary ethics only tells us, quote, what behaviors in the past may have been conducive to the survival of the species and why I may have on occasion moral feelings to act consistently with those behaviors. But evolution cannot tell me whether I ought to act on those feelings in the present and in the future. He goes on. After all, some people in the past raped, stole, and murdered. And I know many people today who have feelings to rape, steal, and murder. Perhaps these behaviors are just as important for my existence and the preservation of the species as the, quote, good behaviors. If morality merely describes what survival behaviors a blind and purposeless evolutionary process has given us, then why should we obey these moral feelings? How do we get from an is to an ought? Atheistic naturalism seems to have no way to explain why anyone ought to act morally. Not only do non-intelligent and non-personal physical processes have no authority to legislate, but they legislate contradictory things. After all, the same evolutionary process that produced Mother Teresa produced Hitler. They both followed their natural inclinations. So how can I ever say which one was right and which was wrong? Evolution may need both of them for the species to survive, so that it would actually be immoral to stop Hitler from doing what he was naturally inclined to do. 1 minute. Philosopher Richard Taylor reminds us, quote, a duty is something that is owed, but something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. So, as we have seen, under atheistic naturalism, there is not a good explanation for the existence of objective moral values and there is no rational reason given for why we should obey moral commands. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill and Adam.
So I guess we're going into the discussion period. The first question I have for you is it's kind of a bit of a paragraph question, so bear with me. But the United States today is much more religiously diverse than at its founding. And there is certainly a greater proportion of atheist Americans than ever before. And yet, as our nation has become less defined by a Christian culture, we have also become more respectful, cooperative, and less hypocritical in our democratic practices. I think we have a long way to go still, but that's a different issue. But consider some of our shameful history: the extermination and resettlement of Native Americans, the Atlantic slave trade, the institutional racism against African Americans, Chinese, Japanese, Irish, etc., the exclusion of women from the right to vote. And I'm not asserting a causal link, but clearly the United States has come to more fully represent the diversity of values and beliefs of its people. And in that process, it has also become a more fair, respectful, and cooperative nation. And when we look at other nations, we find similar patterns. The most atheistic societies today are in Western Europe, Scandinavia, which are also among the world leaders in life expectancy, literacy, GDP, gender equality, access to healthcare, education investments, environmental protection, aid given to developing countries, and a host of other measures. In contrast, countries that evoke God to justify their social ordering are typically really intolerant and inhospitable places. So in practice, does absolute certainty in the immutable righteousness of one's own values encourage dialogue, empathy, and compromise? Or is such unwavering moral certitude more likely to produce zero-sum gains?
Did you repeat the question, please?
Just the last part?
Actually, if you don't mind reading the last
Yeah, I don't mind. So this is, when we talk about morality, which is the good that I think we're implying in the topic, morality has to do with practical issues. So I'm concerned about, in practice, does absolute certainty in the immutable righteousness of one's own values encourage dialogue, empathy, or compromise? Or is such unwavering moral certitude more likely to produce zero-sum gains?
I think you kind of prefaced all that with this notion of intolerance. I heard you say that. If I can ask a follow-up question, so I understand.
Sure.
How do you define tolerance? What exactly do you mean by that?
That's kind of the question I expected. But respect for diversity of values.
Okay. So if I think you're wrong and believe that I'm right, am I disrespecting you in that way?
But do you understand the question, though? As the United States has become less homogenous in its Christian culture, as we've become less Christian, and that's a complaint a lot of evangelicals often level against the United States, as we've become less Christian, we've actually become more respectful of others. We produce less suffering. That's objective in terms of our own populace. Again, Western Europe, Scandinavia. If you're concerned, maybe you don't think life expectancy, GDP, healthcare, children, all those things, maybe you don't think those things are good. But the atheistic societies today are leading in promoting these values. So, again, the question.
I'm not sure what follows from that, though. I mean, I agree that we all agree on moral values, whether you're atheist or Christian, as I said before. So, I think we have a lot of.
But it's precisely, it seems like precisely the loss of moral certitude that you think we need has been what produced or allowed to produce and flourish these types of societies.
I've not researched that in the stats and the numbers. I would be a complete guess to say, yes, you're right, atheist societies are higher. Not something I've looked into, but I'm still not sure what follows.
Just in general, the principle of moral certitude. Doesn't moral certitude...
Josh, I'll actually say something.
Feel free.
Okay. I don't think Christians are any more morally certain than atheists and non-Christians are. And what I mean by that is there seems to be this idea that Christians are come across as absolutely knowing what is right and what is wrong, and there's no question. But I have to say that of many of the atheists that I've known, and I've known many, they are just as certain that they're right about, moral values, that they know what's right and they know what's wrong. So I think the idea that theists are morally certain and atheists are not, they're sort of more tentative in their moral beliefs, is demonstrably false. At least all the people that I've ever met who are atheists have very strong opinions about right and wrong, and remind me all the time when they see me of what I do or what I believe that's right or wrong. So I don't accept the premise that Christians or theists are morally certain and atheists are not. I don't accept that.
So morality is important. God is important for morality only in an abstract sense, but in practice it generally helps to be an atheist.
Say again.
So adding God to morality helps. I don't see how it helps in anything other than an abstract sense. Being an atheist in practice might be better for society. So God, if there's a God, He may want us to be atheists? Question mark?
Is that what I just said? Did you all get that?
Yes.
It wasn't a restatement of your views, it was a question.
I think there's a difference between, and really that's what the crux of this debate is to me tonight, is the difference between, to use two fancy philosophical terms, epistemology and ontology. It's one thing to talk about how we come to know moral values. That's a completely different issue from talking about the existence of objective moral values. We can disagree about the laws of physics, and we can disagree about the natural world and be constantly discovering new things in nature, but that doesn't mean that nature in the physical world doesn't exist.
But do you think these atheists are better able to access, like if you believe in these absolute moral truths that somehow stand outside of the physical realm, that how is it that atheists are better able to access that through their rationality and doubt than Christian societies or Islamic societies?
Well, if we're just going to compare numbers, we could do that all night.
I was not comparing numbers, I'm just asking that.
Well, but we could give counterexamples of Christians ending slavery and Christians who had slaves. As far as that goes, atheistic regimes who thought it was okay to kill millions and millions of people in the name of atheism, whether you want to grant that or not.
Never in the name of atheism, always in the name of something that they were morally certain about, whether it's communism, fascism, whatever you want to call it.
Atheists for the most part.
So that goes back. No, that goes back to the question that I asked was, does absolute certainty in the immutable righteousness, whether that's communism, fascism, whatever, the immutable righteousness of your own value, does that encourage dialogue, cooperation, or does it more likely to result in zero-sum gains?
It depends on what you're certain about that your value is.
I think, Josh, if your question is, can atheists be practically moral, the answer is yes, obviously. Just take Exhibit A and Exhibit B sitting up here.
I appreciate it.
So,
You guys will too.
So there's no doubt that non-theists can live moral lives, and I don't think Adam and I would ever argue that. I don't accept, Josh, your assertion that atheists are better today at being moral than Christians are. I don't see how you could possibly prove that. I mean, you gave some statistics about Scandinavian and Western European countries, but actually coming up with a cause and effect is extremely difficult, as you know, in those kinds of studies. How is the GDP and life expectancy and so forth correlate with a society's religious beliefs? It's very difficult to prove a cause and effect. But I will absolutely grant that atheists can practically be very moral. Absolutely. I wouldn't disagree with that.
Thank you.
I think we'll move on to another question that I think also gets a little bit of this, because one of the things I'm curious about is how practically do you solve moral problems? And so here's an example. I was watching another debate on the same topic, And the Christian who was up there made, I thought, which is a good and interesting statement, which is that, since the 4th century, since before then, societies have had slaves. But in the 4th century, there were a few Christians speaking out against slavery. But I think, I don't have the numbers, but I think it'd be safe to assume, and you can tell me if you think it's a fair assumption or not, probably more Christians during that time had slaves and argued for the goodness of slavery or the morality of slavery. My question to you is, if you're in the 4th century and you see a few Christians arguing against slavery and more Christians arguing for slavery, how do you differentiate between those two claims? How do you figure out which one is what you would consider right and wrong?
I think it's obvious of human dignity that we would agree with that slavery is wrong.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think any normally functioning human would do that. We would have to dehumanize people in order to make ourselves feel like it was okay to.
Were all these people back then not normally functioning humans?
I think they were wrong. But does disagreement equal no objective truth about something?
Well, no. So, but what would be your thought process? Would you just feel empathy for these other people? For the slaves? And that what makes it wrong? Because what I kind of hear from you a little bit is, I don't hear like God necessarily being brought into why you would oppose slavery. Does that make sense?
I would have to read the Bible to tell me that.
Or pray, or do anything like that? Or is it just something you innately know is wrong?
I think we would agree with all use our same normal faculties that we all have.
Well,
Common conscience.
so we have two sources of revelation about morality.
Mm-hmm.
One is certainly Scripture, and second is our conscience. And the book of Romans says that all of us have a moral conscience. So God has implanted in every human being an awareness of right and wrong. So that's why you do not have to believe in God to be moral. So Christians have their conscience, which they can go by, and then they also
5
have...
minutes remaining.
What did you say?
5 minutes remaining.
Oh, you said 5 minutes remaining. I thought you said something like, that's a bad argument.
The unbiased moderator.
I'm going to try to slip in another question real quick, though, about slavery, and you can put your answer, tag it on to the end of this. But again, another kind of paragraph question. The practice of slavery is obviously ancient, and the suffering and misery it generated is beyond my comprehension. The abolition of slavery is a recent phenomenon in the history of our species. In Exodus 21, when Yahweh was instructing the Israelites how to order their society in a way that honored God, the institution of slavery was clearly expected to be a normal part of a theocratic society. And as Sam Harris points out, this is a quote from Harris, the only real restraint God counsels on the subject of slavery is that we not beat our slaves so severely that we injure their eyes or their teeth. And again, you can read Exodus 21 for fun sometime. Slavery is also directly addressed in the New Testament, but it's never called an evil, and it's never called a sin. Instead, Paul tells slaves that they need to be obedient to their masters as they would to Christ himself, Ephesians 6:5. And he also tells his slave masters to be nice to the servants, but maybe he's arguing for a nice kind of slavery. So my question to the Christians is this, and this is multiple questions. Do you consider slavery to be evil? If yes, then was slavery always evil? If your morals are really absolute, like you claim, and slavery was thus always evil, then why did God sanction its practice? If slavery was not always evil, aren't you really a moral relativist? In other words, what was good for them is not good for us because we're in a different time and place.
In 2 minutes or less.
Yeah, how much time?
3 minutes or less.
So we can approach slavery in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, so here's the Cliff Notes. Slavery in the Old Testament in Israel was primarily a poverty program because when you were poor, you may have to sell yourself to another family who would then support you. And that's what they did. all the time.
Is that good?
What's that?
Is that good? Would you say that's a good system?
Well,
Could God not think of a better system
was
for
the
Moses
culture
to teach?
that was in place at the time that Israel existed at that time.
Exodus 21, God's giving orders for how to order a society. So all from scratch, coming into Canaan.
Yeah, that God was dealing with a culture that was deeply fallen and sinful. And he couldn't snap his fingers in a day and get Israel from where he wanted it, where it was, to where he wanted it to be. In Matthew 19:6, Jesus says, Moses permitted such and such because of your hard hearts. So absolutely, God did permit some things to go on in the Old Testament because he was trying to move the people of Israel in a direction.
Kind of like the three-fifths compromise. Just,
What's that?
how is that any different than the three-fifths compromise? How is this not just dealing with reality as it is?
If you take the Old Testament seriously, God gave specific commands for a specific people at a specific time in a specific geography. He was trying to make them into a holy people because the Messiah would eventually come out of it, okay?
1 minute.
We understand as Christians that the Old Testament contains both instructions for Israel and general principles.
So slavery was not always evil if God could tolerate it?
No, I think slavery was always evil, and
So God can
was
tolerate evil?
moving Israel in a direction away from slavery. In fact, in the New Testament, if you mention the New Testament, masters were supposed to treat their slaves as if they were slaves of Christ. They were not supposed to threaten slaves. They were supposed to recognize that they had no preferential treatment before God, masters that is. They were supposed to give slaves what was right and fair. They were not supposed to steal. Slaves were supposed to obey in sincerity of heart. Slaves were supposed to work with all.
I have a question though. Why didn't we say that in our Emancipation Proclamation? Why didn't we just tell Southern slave owners, hey,
Because
just be
you're
nice to your
dealing
slaves?
with a culture that is moving in a direction. And Christianity and in the Old Testament, New Testament was constantly pushing the culture forward to higher moral ground. But it couldn't happen in a day.
So morals aren't
And
absolute.
Jesus actually wasn't interested primarily in social institutions and structures. He was interested in changing people's hearts.
He wasn't interested in alleviating suffering or ending slavery.
He alleviated a lot of suffering. If you read the Gospels, you would know that.
I think we're going to take just a few seconds break for our camera people to do what they need to do, and then we're going to hand the discussion over to our friends from Ratio Christi. You've got 17 minutes.
Josh, that was very clever to ask me a question that would take me an hour to answer and give me 3 minutes. I'm just kidding. So, let's talk about, can there be good without God? I was interested in how would you respond to Michael Roos's comment. He said, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. How do you respond to his statement? Do you agree with it, disagree with it?
Ethics as the practice of trying to figure out how we ought to relate to one another is not illusory. I think it's illusory to say that there's a standard outside of what humans create, yeah.
Okay, so would you agree that as an objective, as a rationally justifiable set of claims about something objective, that it is illusory?
No.
So you're not a moral relativist.
No, I'm a moral objectivist, but not a moral absolutist.
Where do objective moral values come from?
From our evolution and from our culture, from multiple factors.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit by saying our moral values come from ourselves. Now, we can explain sort of how those moral values came about, through evolution by saying, like, you were saying that you had some sort of, you felt, bad for the slaves. You have this idea of basic human dignity. You want to see other people prosper and live, right? I would assume, correct? And you were saying that those ideas came from God. Well, we can actually explain why we have those ideas through evolution, because that's what was advantageous to our species to cooperate with each other.
So
That doesn't make it an ought per se.
how do you deal with the fact that evolution has produced people that have natural inclinations to rape, steal, and murder? on what grounds can you say that they're wrong? Because the same process that caused people to love and be kind has also caused people to hate and be cruel. So if that is the source of moral values, then how do you pick and choose? What standard are you appealing to above evolution to determine?
If our if our moral inclinations were given us by some sort of divine being, I wouldn't expect some people to have the inclination to murder and rape. But precisely because it has been a blind process and guided by natural selection, guided by a host of other factors, natural factors, we do have these sort of things. But human beings are a social primate species. So in a group, if we have a group of humans and an individual wants to rape and murder, well, if the rest of the humans in that group want to flourish, they have to take control of that renegade individual. So we construct systems to control this aberrant behavior.
So there's nothing actually wrong with rape?
Absolutely. It hurts people. So we determine what's wrong.
Why is it wrong to hurt people, though?
Can you think of no other reason that's wrong than God says no? If not, that's terrifying to me.
I think it's because people have value.
People have value?
I think so too. People
Where
have
does the value
value.
come from?
Well, from myself, because I care about the people around me. I care about you too. I care about Austin. I care about Josh. I care about the people in the audience.
Robert, what do you say to people that don't care about other people? How are they wrong in any objective sense? How can you tell them you are wrong without it just being you expressing your emotions or feelings?
Well, they're wrong because I say they're wrong. Now they may have different values than I do. If they don't want to flourish in society, then they don't get to be a part of the conversation as to what allows us to flourish in society.
I would agree they're not wrong by some sort of transhuman standard.
Because it doesn't exist. Morality is, in some ways, a social.
Fortunately, we don't live in a.
That's moral relativism, right? So
Morality is illusory.
each person has their own moral beliefs and values, and you have yours, and I have mine, and Josh has his, and Adam has his, and so it sounds like you're agreeing with Michael Roos that morality as an objective set of claims is illusory. There's no such thing, which collapses us down to moral relativism. Or at least, Robert, you seem to be agreeing with that. Josh, you're holding out.
No,
Why are you holding out?
Well, in a certain sense, that's true. We weren't given any. I don't believe we were given any divine list of what constitutes good behavior. In fact, our experience as a social species, trying to cooperate with one another and flourishing within our societies, we butt up against experiences of extreme misery, of extreme suffering. And it's our reaction to these experiences that we construct ideas of what ought to be valued and what ought to be protected for us to thrive. If someone does not value life, I can't convince them. I can't give them a good ultimate reason. That's true. But fortunately for us as a species, what it basically means to be human is, part of it is that we value life. Does that mean there's going to be members of our species that don't? Sure. There are ants that don't stick with the colony, but that's not typical. So that's my answer. I don't see why we need to, if there's a good reason why we oppose rape, and I think everybody in here can think of a reason why we don't want rape going on. I don't want to be raped. And if I don't want to be raped, what makes me think somebody else would not want to be raped? And if I want to live in a way that I can maximize my own potential, I know I'm going to have to cooperate with others. And so we have to respect one another. And you can still believe in God and believe in that, but you don't have to believe in God.
Two follow-up questions to that. One, how does morality not become simple selfishness? I should not be selfish. I should cooperate in order that I can be more thoroughly selfish so that I can flourish.
Well, we're not entirely selfish creatures. We also care about each other. We constantly make sacrifices for each other.
And just for me, why would that possibly be the case? It's self-sacrifice if my goal is for myself to flourish within a society.
Well, my goal isn't just for myself to flourish. It's also to help other people around me flourish.
Why?
Because I care about other people.
Because that's what I value. Ultimately, because that's what I value, right? Because that's what I find beneficial. I agree that it comes back to the individual. I don't see how that's any different for the theist either. Jesus tells someone to do something in order that they might inherit the kingdom of heaven. So the whole parable of the Good Samaritan was, how do I inherit the kingdom of heaven? You lose your life according to Jesus so that you can find it. You're not going to find any rationale at its basis for good behavior that doesn't appeal to the individual's self-interest.
I think many Christians do. I'm going to be a Christian, so I don't want to go to hell, and I'm going to help people. So
Jesus told people to do things, and he gave them individual
there are
consequences.
rewards. There's nothing wrong with that.
He told
it also
them-
says we love because God loves us. But we're not debating Christianity tonight. We're debating theism. We're not debating the Bible, which somehow we keep
theism-
getting back to.
Well, theism by itself is, why wouldn't you want to bring Christianity into your theism?
Because it's not the question.
Not as defensible?
Can there be good without God? No, it's not the question. We only have 17 minutes, so move on to what the actual question is. And now I forgot what my other point was. Something about how does this not boil down to Mike makes right? If it's all about the society flourishing. What if that society, and I have to do it, is Nazi Germany? I was going to try not to use Hitler in any of my talk tonight. But
Way to God.
how does that not happen? And how can a moral reformer, such as the person advocating to stop slavery, if antebellum South slavery is the norm for society, they would actually be doing something immoral to disrupt the society. If society is the standard for morality,
They would be doing something against the social norm, sure. My thought about, sorry.
I was just going to ask you have different societies with different norms, right? But what I hear you guys saying all the time is you're constantly invoking a standard. You're holding other people responsible for bad behaviors. You're holding ancient Israel responsible for slavery. You're making moral judgments.
Who should I hold responsible?
But how can you hold a different culture at a different time responsible when there's no objective standard? You keep appealing to a standard and then you go, but there's not one. And then you appeal to the standard and then you go, but there's not one. And so you keep claiming these people are wrong, those people are wrong, these people did something bad, those people are bad. But they are in a different culture, they have different norms. Going with moral relativism, it doesn't seem to me that you can ever say that anybody is right or wrong. All you can say is, I don't like the fact that they had slaves. That bothers me. Well, that's great that it bothers you, but in what sense is it objectively wrong? How can you and Robert keep making claims about objective moral rightness and wrongness, and in the next sentence say, but there's no standard?
Well, Robert Morality 101. We have, we all have different values. Actually, luckily, most of our values are similar because of these evolutionary processes that I talk about. They can help explain those things. Now, once we come together and we agree on shared values, we can figure out objectively how we can best enact those values. And that's the objective standard that I'm talking about. I care about individual human dignity, respect for other people's self-worth. I care about creating a free and open society in which everyone can flourish and sort of be their best person. Slavery, a society that has slavery, objectively does not achieve those goals.
Right. You asked how
But there was clearly human flourishing going on when, for some people,
For who is this? Yeah, I'm
the
concerned
slave
about.
owners, right? They were flourishing. So under your system, the slave owners were doing just fine, and in their morality, owning slaves worked out quite nicely for them. Their GDP was up. Their life expectancies were longer. They were doing great.
I don't care about just the slave owners.
How can you tell those slave owners that they were acting objectively wrong? I don't think you can. I think all you can say is, I don't like what you're doing.
you asked
Go ahead.
how I can hold ancient Israel accountable for its practice of slavery, precisely because I don't believe in Yahweh. I don't believe it was a divine mandate. Because we're constructing systems to try to figure out how we're going to cooperate with one another and live together and how we're going to thrive with one another, precisely because we decide for ourselves what is right and wrong. Precisely because that, I can hold them responsible for their decisions if they made that decision. Now, I can say that slavery produced an immense amount of suffering. Now, you can say, well, who are you to say that suffering is good? or bad. And I can say, okay, everyone that says suffering is good, stand on that side of the line, and everyone that says suffering is bad, come over here.
5 minutes.
So I think it's important. It's an important principle of human society that we try to minimize suffering within our in-group. And the great thing about human evolution, the evolution of our societies, is as we move from tribalism to chiefdoms to states to now this international community, our circles, our interdependence with one another has expanded and continues to expand. So now it is much more important that I actually be concerned about your rights. We don't come into this world inherently concerned about universal human rights. That comes after the world wars and our experiences with suffering. Our experiences are what teaches us how we ought to shape our future if we want to avoid those nasty things.
But if our experiences teach us morality, in other words, morality, it seems like you're saying, is getting better and better as history goes by. It's getting better against what standards?
Better and better if you're concerned about peace and stability. If you're not, I'm sorry.
But you keep invoking a standard. You keep saying ancient Israel was worse than we are. We're better than they are. We behave better than they are. But they were living out their experiences given to them by evolution and culture the same way we are. So you guys keep saying that these things are all good and these things are all bad, and you're judging other societies and you're judging behaviors in the past.
No, if you're concerned about minimizing suffering and increasing social wellness,
but maybe they weren't
for humans
concerned about
and
that,
sentient
right?
creatures.
Maybe that wasn't their greatest concern at that time. So how can you judge them to be wrong?
I can judge them to be wrong in the sense if they're concerned about peace, stability, those sorts of things, then they're wrong. If that's not their concern, then I can say that my values don't line up with their values and I find no value in the Bible, which I don't.
So they weren't wrong. You just don't like what they did. Their values don't line up with yours.
I have a question.
I thought it was hard. Hey, wait a second.
Just question and response.
Yeah, well, kind of. Yeah. How do you know what the objective standard is? How do you figure that out? You're saying that we don't have an objective standard. We keep appealing to one. Where does yours come from?
It comes from general revelation and special revelation. It comes from the Word of God and from our conscience.
Which we have the same faculties. We agree with you that slavery
We have
is wrong.
access.
We're just trying to
We both have
ontological
access.
grounds.
Say Christians don't have that access when slavery was not abolished.
They were totally acting against what they should have done. They were wrong.
Yeah, so the fact that Christians have behaved badly proves nothing.
The fact that atheists behave badly proves nothing. Whatever that bad is, we still haven't established how we have that standard. But
I mean, I think we would agree that Christians throughout history have at times done a poor job of recognizing the objective moral values that exist.
Thanks to the Bible.
For sure.
Yeah.
Not the Bible. I mean, I was continuing my lesson, but you got that right in there.
But how can you judge? So
It's
you got.
very clever that way.
I guess I'm still confused though as to if you see slavery is okay in the Bible, you see killing children is okay, you see genocide is okay in the Bible. I still don't understand.
It's not. All those things are inaccurate representations of what the Bible promotes.
Read Numbers 31, please.
Yes, please.
In context,
Read
please.
Numbers 25 as well, and Numbers 22.
But we're not debating the Bible.
But
Well, I know that, but
the Bible doesn't promote genocide or slavery. These are red herrings. They're not true. They're not correct, and
They're doing a great job of taking up time. So kudos.
Well, did you have another question?
But you can't say that those things are wrong because those people were in a different culture, in a different time, and had their own experiences and had their own ideas of human flourishing and their own ideas of promoting human welfare. But you keep saying that they're wrong over and over again. You keep saying that. You want to believe in objective moral values, I think. But your worldview stops you right at the brink of admitting that objective moral values exist. You stop and you go, I can't say that. Because where would they come from? Where would these values come from?
I think you showed this in your opening statement, Josh, when you said there's no universal principle of morality. And then you went on to say, genocide, we can all agree that that's wrong. Rape, is it ever good? Are you serious? Appealing to the fact that there is a universal moral value that we all understand. The question is, where does that come from?
But you gave examples of where that's not true. Okay, we're going to take 1 minute while the panelists prepare their closing statements. We can have everybody settle back in. We're going to hear a closing statement from Ratio Christi. We have 5 minutes, and then the atheists are going to take another 5 minutes for their closing statements. If we could have silence, please.
Okay. So Adam and I would again like to thank Robert and Josh for their participation tonight, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope that regardless of where you were leaning tonight when you came in here, that you learned something from both sides, because I think you've gotten a clear view of what they believe, a clear view of what we believe, and maybe in the Q&A it'll become even more clear. But the question we faced tonight was, can there be good without God? And Adam and I answered the question, no. We showed that morality consists of objective moral values and duties that cannot be rationally explained by atheistic naturalism. Under atheistic naturalism, morality collapses into emotions and instincts. Since emotions and instincts vary from person to person, from culture to culture, then there can be no objective standard for morality. You may not like my behavior, but you cannot rationally say that I am wrong in any objective sense. For you to say that I am objectively wrong, you must invoke a transcendent standard that applies to all people at all times and all places. Likewise, under atheistic naturalism, there is no rational grounding for moral duties. Atheists may develop dozens of ethical theories based on maxims such as do less harm or promote human flourishing. But the person who disagrees with these commands may rightly ask, why should I accept your ethical theory? By what authority does the atheist tell anyone to be moral? If moral instincts truly come from the undirected, impersonal, biological process of evolution, then there is no legitimate prescriber of moral duties. Mere chemicals are not lawmakers. Only persons are lawmakers. Atheist philosopher Kai Nielsen disappoints the atheist who hopes to provide rational grounds for morality. Here's what he says, quote, "We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that all really rational persons should not just be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality." End quote. Contrast Nielsen with another famous atheist, Friedrich Nietzsche. He said the following, "Morality has truth only if God is truth. It stands or falls with faith in God." Here we can agree with Nietzsche. Christian theism supplies rational grounds for being moral. The Christian God's very nature is the ultimate source for good. God is just and loving. He is morally perfect and therefore stands as the transcendent moral standard that all mankind can appeal to. In addition, because God's will comes from his perfect moral nature, we have found the only legitimate authority from whom moral commands may issue. Why should I love my neighbor? Because the ultimate source of moral good has commanded me to. Only God can rightfully give us moral commands. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of Christianity is that God doesn't merely command us to be good. Although his command would be sufficient, he didn't stop there. He demonstrated his love by sending his very Son, Jesus Christ, to earth to live a perfect moral life, and then to sacrifice himself because of our numerous and egregious acts of evil. The Christian God doesn't just say, love your neighbor, he shows us how. Jesus said, my command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Thank you.
Thank you guys for having this discussion with us, and I know I can be kind of hostile towards religion sometimes, but a couple of points before I read my conclusion. One of the opposition to our atheistic perspective was that inevitably morality is just a might makes right sort of thing. I think the theistic perspective is much more of a might makes right sort of thing. You have this celestial bully in the sky saying do this or else. They've also said that morality is in some sense nonsensical without an appeal to, quote, a transcendent standard that applies to all people at all times and all places. If you're the type of Christian who believes literally in the Bible, clearly there is no sort of standard. But there are many instances where belief in a God was or is used to justify the struggle for values that most of us today would consider indispensable for a decent human society. But how does one arrive at the conclusion that certain religiously motivated behaviors are desirable, while other religiously motivated behaviors are undesirable? It's simply a matter of fact that society is made up of individuals with a broad array of values and beliefs. This is the world that we inhabit. And in such a pluralistic society, I don't think you can legitimate societal norms by appealing to what religious people believe is favorable to their particular gods. We disagree on what the nature of the gods is actually like, or if you're like us atheists, find no compelling reason to believe in any deity at all. But precisely out of respect for religious liberty, we must find a common language where we offer our reasoning for advancing social policies and protections. As Matt Ridley, the geneticist, writer on genetics, has written, life is as much about cooperation as it is about competition. It makes sense from a naturalist perspective why humans are concerned about fairness, why we would need to cultivate trust, and why we need to find ways to limit detrimental exploitation of our social order. And in a sense, this is part of what it means to be human. So whether or not you believe in a God, we still must figure out how to live with each other and even flourish with one another. And our experience with suffering and misery has taught us that certain values are worth fighting for and defending. We cultivate a reasonable sense of proportional reaction when confronted with different values. The murderers and rapists need to be at least restrained if a society is to flourish. Differences on issues of lower priority are treated accordingly, such as differences in taste of ice cream. The history of religion is mixed when it comes to what values individuals and denominations believe are in line with God's nature. But you and I are able to judge the merits of this or that religiously motivated behavior by utilizing non-religious discourse. And as I said in my opening statement, if we are concerned with reducing the overwhelming, gratuitous suffering in our world, we must find a way to reason with one another, cooperate, and respect one another. Thank you.
What I want to do is leave you tonight with an answer to a common question. If you're an atheist and do not believe in God, why are you good? On a basic level, I am good because I have empathy for other people, and I do not want to see them suffer. But more than that, my friends and family are the most important things in my life. All I want to do is help them and do things that bring them happiness and joy. I have two of the best parents in the world who have given me so much, including the tools I need to be the person I am here today. In return, I want to honor the sacrifices they have made for me to be someone that they can be proud of. Our moral guidance does not come from on high. This is true. But it does come from the love and respect that we have for all people. Thanks.
Thanks to both sides of our panel for these closing statements. We're now going to take about a 10-minute break for the audience to craft your questions, get those down on that note card, and then you can give that to one of our volunteers who will be collecting them. Could our volunteers raise their hands or stand up? Yeah. If you want to finish up your question and get that card done, please find it.
Maybe 9, 10 or so. We're going to start with a question for the atheists, and then we'll finish with a question for, and we'll go back and forth until we finally run out of time. And then we'll finish with a question to our Christian friends. And if we can get that first question.
This is in reference to a previous statement that I believe Josh made. It's pretty straightforward. How can you call God a bully in the sky?
Because he is.
If it's the God as of the Bible, it depends on how you would define bullying. Forcing the more vulnerable, weak people to do what you want because that's what you want seems like a pretty standard definition of bullying.
Okay, to Ratio Christi, what is the evidence that God is, that's in quotation marks, objective moral values? Please do not use scripture. That's what it says on the card. I mean,
Okay. Well, I don't think we've, to make our arguments, I don't think we've used scripture all night. It was when we were dragged into debating the Bible that we had to use scripture, obviously. That's okay. I think you have to have a metaphysical stopping point. And if you aren't familiar with the word, metaphysics is just the study of being. I think we all agree that objective moral values exist. We can not use those terms, but as they've demonstrated tonight, we all agree genocide is wrong, rape is wrong, etc., etc. We have to have a stopping point for why. Otherwise, it's completely arbitrary and relative, as we've been arguing. Why is God that stopping point? The same question applies to the atheist. If it's a non-personal, something brute fact that is just out there, why is that good? We could ask that question on and on and on and on, and well, it appeals to a standard beyond it. Well, why is that good? Well, it appeals to a standard beyond it. You have to have a stopping point, otherwise you have nothing. You just go on to infinity and never answer the question. And I think what we've argued is if morality, objective moral values are duties, and you have moral obligations, that only applies to another person. Like I said in my opening statement, you don't have a moral obligation to gravity if you go to the moon. You're not doing anything morally wrong. You only have moral obligations to other persons. So if we have to have that metaphysical stopping point to what the good is, and the good involves moral obligations, well, that metaphysical stopping point has to be personal being. Anything to add to that?
There's a couple of parts to this, so I'm going to finish the couple of questions. If you have no reward or punishment past your life on earth, why would you feel compelled to do good? Wouldn't your best life possible be to selfishly do everything in your power to make your enjoyment in life as good as it can possibly be? This could easily include cheating, lying, and stealing. How or why would helping others or sacrificing for others make your life objectively better?
Well, the reward I get, the reward I get for being good is feeling good myself. I'm not concerned. I'm not worried about any sort of divine reward or punishment. I find reward in seeing my friends be happy and pleased with who I am and in hanging out with me and things like that. What was the rest? What was the second one?
I suppose seeking justification for how something can be objectively better and not an opinion of yours, something makes you feel better. How is doing anything compassionate objectively better, I guess is what.
well, it's objectively better by the standard of I want to feel better. And I don't get pleasure from hurting other people. I get pleasure from helping other people. From being, in general, what I would consider a good person, which is helping others, not to sound too repetitive.
And in terms of the best possible life, clearly the best possible life that we can have isn't by cheating, lying, and stealing all the time. There are places in the world that we call failed states that don't have any structure, governance, no laws, restricting people's behavior. I don't want to live in Somalia. Why? I could kill anybody I want if I was in Somalia. I could rape anybody I want if I was in Somalia. Why not? Because we have to cooperate to find a fullness to life. Driving here requires a bunch of people putting together a car. I can't make a car by myself. A bunch of people making a road. I can't make a road by myself. A bunch of people writing books that I can read so I can learn how to drive. I can't maximize my own potential without cooperating with other people. We thrive, not just by competition, but by cooperation. The best possible life is not Somalia. That's why you have refugees leaving Somalia to places like Western Europe and the United States, and you don't have that same sort of influx from the United States into Somalia.
To Ratio Christi, from Adi, if moral principles are absolute and immutable, how do you explain the changing moral zeitgeist which is evident from human history?
Well, again, we're confusing epistemology with ontology. And this is the constant mistake that is made in this debate. The fact that we don't have perfect knowledge and we don't agree on every moral value doesn't mean that moral values don't exist. Just like the fact that we disagree about the laws of nature doesn't mean that nature doesn't exist. So disagreeing about moral values proves absolutely nothing as to whether they exist or not. It is completely irrelevant. It's two different questions. So, in fact, the reason we're constantly arguing over moral values is because we want to show that our understanding is right and the other person's is wrong. But that only makes sense if there's a standard to which we're both appealing to at the same time. So changing moral values over time is a red herring for the discussion tonight. It's an interesting question. Maybe we could have another panel discussion on that. I'm just kidding. I need at least a 6-month break. But it has nothing to do with the question tonight. Again, it's a good question. It's interesting, but it really has nothing to do with whether objective moral values exist or not.
I would just add, just to push it a little bit further even, it seems like the underlying premise to the question is disagreements automatically equals no objective truth. And if that's the case, then, hey, I disagree with you guys, so therefore your worldview is false. End of discussion. But we know that's nonsense. That just doesn't logically follow that just because you disagree about something means there is no right answer.
This has to do with, I recall there was talking about discovering moral principles as opposed to them being presupposed by some tradition. How can you contend that we must discover moral principles and that we create morality? How does it make sense to discover a principle that we personally create? And also, how can we pass judgment on someone who discovers a different moral principle, for example, murder, than we have?
I hope I never said discovered. We construct based on our experience. So what I said in my opening statement was based on collective experiences of abject misery. We attempt to erect positive barriers we call rights against which future aggressive behaviors are not permitted to transgress. We didn't discover the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We constructed it in December 1948 in the shadow of the Holocaust because we witnessed something that was so mind-blowingly crazy in the level of suffering, disregard for others. That sort of society not only perpetuates misery on the vulnerable, but that sort of society could end up enveloping the whole world. So in the aftermath of 2 world wars, we try to erect systems to protect what we value in life. And Bill said that the reason that we argue about moral standards is because we want to show we're right. And I disagree. I think we argue about what's right and wrong because we know what it's like to suffer. I know what it's like to suffer, and I don't want people infringing on my life and making me suffer. I don't want people taking away my right to enjoy certain music. I don't want people taking away my ability to enjoy certain kinds of foods. And so I argue about what's right and wrong based on my experiences because I don't want to have that experience again. Not because I want to show I'm right. I obviously don't have all the right answers. Not that there are necessarily right answers in an ultimate sense that's outside of humanity. If there was an answer that's outside of humanity, it seems like it would be pretty irrelevant to those of us who are stuck in our humanity.
Good answer.
Ratio Christi. If Christians have had massive disagreements in the past, how could which side know who was correct? At least more relativists have reasons to disagree and learn from experience, thus shaping their morality.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said a while ago. Disagreement doesn't equal no right answer. Like Bill said, we have both natural revelation and special revelation. And of course, tonight, our goal was simply to appeal to natural revelation that we all have access to via our conscience. Do people disregard that? Certainly. Do people disregard that in the name of Christ? Certainly. Does that mean there is no right answer? Well, again, the answer is no. And of course, we don't have time to get into the debating who is right and who is wrong in any specific case. But I forget who the quote is from. But essentially it's saying, we start with the clear and we work to the unclear. Everybody knows torturing babies for fun is wrong. Don't think there's any question about that. Are there moral disagreements and gray areas? Possibly, but the quote goes something like, simply because there's twilight doesn't mean we don't know day and night. So we start with the clear cases and then we work to the unclear cases. A simple, quick answer.
I would just add that if you're a true moral relativist, then you completely give up the right to judge anybody else's behavior. You just do. All you do when you say somebody's done something wrong is just express your personal preference. I don't like what that guy did. I don't like what he's saying. But, we quoted several atheist philosophers who agree with exactly what I'm saying, who say that, under atheistic naturalism, if you're a true moral relativist, there can be no moral reform. How could you ever reform a society? It just is what it is. You can never disagree with anybody. You can never pass moral judgments on anybody else because there's no standard to which you can appeal to. The standard exists within each of us. As Robert and Josh said, the standard is within each of us, and if it just so happens that my standard is different from yours, well, too bad. You can tell me I'm wrong, but I'm just going to hear that from a moral relativist as somebody saying, I like vanilla and you like chocolate. That's what it sounds like because there's no standard they're appealing to.
This one is somewhat like this one. Some atheists, such as Sam Harris, argue that rape played a very beneficial evolutionary role for humans in the past. With that being the case, upon what basis do you condemn the actions of the ancient Middle East, since most atheists have argued that morality is evolving continually? After all, if society, genetics, and individual reason determines morality, who are you to question their moral standards of that time?
I'm not familiar with and I've read everything by Sam Harris. I'm not familiar with the argument that rape was part of our. I think the author of the card is mistaken.
I can't speak to that.
To quote Matt Ridley again, life is just as much about selfishness as it is about cooperation. Mutations that make genes suppress the selfishness of other genes are just as likely to survive as selfish mutants. Part of what we are as a species is individuals with self-needs. But part of what we are too is that we can only actualize those those needs and potentials through cooperation with others. And I would think rape in such a situation would be very damaging for all involved.
And I would add that I think the question gets at this false idea that we're trying to say that you can get an ostrich and is. We're not trying to say that at all. There are things that are. Evolution helps explain sort of why we have certain ideas. It helps explain why those feelings and empathy and things like that have come about. But it doesn't necessarily tell us that those are actually good. What tells us those are actually good are ourselves and sort of the rationality that we use to get at that. And I would just add one more thing, that the question, I think it generally does come up, the idea that, well, rape would be good for our society because if all the men just went around and raped all the women, we produce a lot of offspring, and that would be good for the survival of the species. But we don't even really see that in a lot of the animal kingdom. In a lot of mammalian species, women get to choose who they mate with, by various means. It's not like forcing yourself upon a woman is actually even evolutionary beneficial for the species.
Ratio Christi from Adi. Since there is no objective proof for the Christian theism, isn't it superfluous to build your morals on it? Isn't Christian theism an invalid premise?
He gave his argument.
Yeah, well,
Obviously, this guy doesn't think it worked.
Depends on what you mean by objective.
You could give it again.
First of all, and we're certainly not trying to prove the theistic God, much less the Christian God, simply based on this one argument. But the argument I gave is completely sound. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist, objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. If the premises are true, the conclusion is inescapable. We can ask questions about what kind of God that is, but that is a sound argument. It's valid, it is sound, because I believe the premises are true. There are other arguments we could give, but of course this isn't truly a debate about the existence of God. It is more of a debate about can there be good without God, and I think that argument does serve the purpose to answer the question tonight, so I used it.
And really are, as Adam said, the question is can there be good without God? So our position tonight assumes it's a given that God exists. Like Adam said, we could have done a debate on does God exist. In fact, I think you guys...
April 14th.
April 14th. You sponsored a debate on that very topic. So Adam and I are just using that as an assumption, as a given. And Adam actually went a little further and actually gave a little argument for God's existence. But again, that's not... We didn't come to prove God's existence tonight. That would be a completely different debate. April 14th, though. There will be a debate on that topic. In here?
We don't know yet.
Okay. Check the Facebook.
Yes.
This is directed to Robert.
Oh, jeez.
This is a two-person.
Somebody called you out.
Sorry.
I do not want Josh to answer this question.
I'm going to write this down.
Obviously, either of you can respond. If you say you are good because you have empathy for others, wasn't this taught to you by your parents? And what would you do if someone hurt your family? Would you have empathy for that person?
Yes. I actually, to get on a little touchy subject, I wrote a little bit about the Tuscany shooting incident on Facebook, and I said that if our society is going to be truly great, we must have sympathy and empathy not only for the victims, but for the perpetrator and himself and his family. And if we're not going to do that, then we'll continue to be we'll continue in this cycle of violence and hate for each other, and we need to break that.
Most people of the time seem to agree that the universal moral standard that increasing human happiness and decreasing human suffering, this is a moral standard precisely because it is so ubiquitous. This standard has been shown to be objectively linked to certain parts of the human brain. For instance, mirror neurons, such as the probing of the regions causes to exemplify compassion, empathy, and altruism. Likewise, trauma in these regions of the brain renders people incapable of empathy. Where is the need for God to explain these phenomena when neurology will suffice?
Well, again, what's good about these questions is it lets me say the same thing. Because your brain has developed through a blind and purposeless process of evolution to give you feelings of altruism doesn't get you from the is to the ought, as Robert said. So there are all sorts of feelings and instincts that evolution has given people. Evolution gave Jeffrey Dahmer instincts to do what he did. Evolution's given murderers instincts to do what they did. Gave Hitler his instincts. You could go on and on and on. So just because we have certain feelings that evolution's giving us doesn't explain why we should follow those instincts. In fact, part of what it is to be moral is to go against our instincts. Like sometimes, I have the instinct to want to lie to get out of a situation. But then morality kicks in and I think, no, I should not do that. I have a duty not to lie. But my instincts are telling me to lie. So this constant appeal to evolution and biology has given us these moral feelings and instincts gets you nowhere. All it does is describe how you feel, but it doesn't prescribe what you should do. And part of morality is deciding which instinct do I follow, this one or this one. If I walk by a river and I see a kid drowning in the river, I have two instincts. One is to jump in and save him. The second one is to leave because I can endanger my life by jumping in. I have to decide which instinct to follow. So I guess I beat that horse dead. But we keep getting asked the same kind of questions. I'll just keep giving the same.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll come up with more interesting examples.
I would just really quickly add to that as the assumption obviously is built into the question that our genes and our neurons determine our behavior, which Bill has discussed, but it doesn't necessarily follow that there's a link. Just because there's a link between a certain brain function or state that is necessarily causing the event. There could be something else going on there. It doesn't necessarily follow that is the only cause. And I totally forgot what else I was going to say, but it was pretty good. Maybe I'll think of it later.
To sort of be efficient, I'm going to fuse two questions together. I see that they're rather similar, so please pause with me here. If evolution is the source of morals, then how can you say that, I hate to bring up Hitler, but it's relevant, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, who have killed millions, are bad? Were they not just a byproduct of evolution with their own moral code that they came up with? And along those lines, what is the difference between the flourishing and destruction of those respective cultures that those dictators headed up? And what is even the difference between pleasure and pain? Are those not just chemical reactions going along with atheistic naturalism? Are not all achievements and people just dust in the end? How can you judge any of those things when theoretically with atheistic naturalism nothing matters?
I think it's interesting the Nazi example. It's a matter of contention what Hitler's personal beliefs were. So if you read his speeches or read Mein Kampf, he explicitly says that he's doing things according to the Christian faith at times. Then you read other statements that he makes in private, and that's thrown into doubt. But obviously, the way it was sold to the German people, because Hitler wasn't the one who was turning the awful, monstrous machine of Nazi Germany. It was executed by the Germans. And how did Hitler and the Nazis get the German people to go along? They did it by giving them absolute moral clarity and saying, this is absolutely right. They appealed to the writings of Martin Luther and said the Jews are responsible for killing Christ, therefore the Jews are evil in this particular sense. They constructed these nasty historical narratives people have an innate sense of fairness. And so what Hitler did was try to sell the fairness of the Nazi program and say, hey, look, the Jews are a real danger to us. We have to do something. The Jews are a lesser race. But they gave them false history, a false science, something that good science and good reason and good rationality can't correct. But then if you look at the heroic Germans who stood up against the Nazis, who are a couple examples? One famous example is Martin Niemöller, right? He has the famous poem that I wrote down. It says, in Germany, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time there was no one left to speak up. The rationality, our horror of the Holocaust, was this sense of empathy. It had nothing to do with what is absolute or outside of ourselves. Our experience was suffering. And at first I didn't care what they were doing to other people because, hey, that's not me. But then I realized if I think like that, I'm going to be caught in that machinery eventually too. The only way we can move forward as a society is if we're concerned with one another. And there are people that disagree with that. And I think that at some level we're not going to be able to convince one another. That's why we fight over values sometimes. But those of us who believe that we must cooperate and respect one another to thrive and to move forward in life, we actually have to fight for that value.
Yeah, I just want to take hopefully 20 seconds to add one other thing. Evolution is not the source of morals. I've said that a couple times. It's an explanation for our morals. And the reason why that's important is because theists will often try and say that God has written morality onto our hearts. That's why we all have this sort of shared sense of ethic. That's why we all up here have similar values and ideas as to what matters to us. What we want to advance with evolution is not that it's the source of our morals, but it's an explanation for why we all have a shared values that doesn't come from God. So what we're trying to say is that we're saying our values are influenced by evolution and they don't require God, whereas they're trying to add something else onto it, another unevidenced sort of statement that isn't even required to explain why things are the way they are today.
Right. Part of what it means to be human is to be concerned about fairness. We understand that because of evolution.
We've got about 3 minutes left, so this next question for Ratio Christi will serve as our conclusion.
To Bill, this is the personal question. You say God can't snap his fingers and end slavery, but God created the world in 7 days. How are these ideas compatible?
Well,
You got 3 minutes.
I have 3 minutes.
Take it down.
Last time I had 3 minutes. Well, first of all, I don't personally believe that God created the world in 7 days. So I am perfectly willing to accept the standard theories from astronomy and physics that the universe is 14 billion years old roughly, and the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. So I don't even agree with the first part of the question. Some Christians believe that, some don't. It's not a matter of orthodoxy. But with regard to culture, God created the earth, Adam and Eve, and they were perfect, and they went bad. And culture went bad, society went bad, there was a fall, and God has chosen to work through flawed people through the process of history to bring us eventually to a perfect world, a paradise, where evil will be quarantined from good. Why has God chosen to use human beings and history and cultures and so forth to accomplish this? I don't know. I don't have that answer. But that's how he's decided to do it. And I don't see how that is incompatible at all with a perfectly loving and just God to take us through this process. I don't really see an issue with it at all.
And we got about 45 seconds.
Okay. Well, since everybody wants to keep bringing up the Bible, I will close with a scripture passage that I think does kind of speak to that. 2 Peter 3:9, the Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. So the question is, if God decided to end slavery and every evil in the world right this very second, regardless of whose standard of morality you use, do you live up to it perfectly? I imagine the answer is no. But if God ends every evil, and you're part of that evil, where does that leave you if he ends it at midnight tonight? So I think that's part of the reason why the slowness that we see is taking place.
All right. Thanks once again to all our panelists. If we can just give them a nice little I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's been great. I just want to one more time plug the UNCG Atheists, Agnostics, and Skeptics. Their group meets weekly, and Ratio Christi also has weekly meetings as well, so check them out. And if you would be so kind, exit in a nice, quiet, orderly manner, and don't forget to drop off those little poll cards we had you do. There will be an attendant out front or a bin or something, I think.
There will be a couple people out there with
Okay. Where we